So as Daniel said, my name is Martha Burtis. I direct a center at the University of Mary Washington, a fairly new center called the Digital Knowledge Center. I worked for years in teaching and learning technologies, which is the division that Jesse now directs. My center is, Jesse's division is focused on faculty development and curriculum development, and really pushing the boundaries of innovative pedagogy with our faculty. My center was brought in a few years ago to push the envelope in terms of student development and providing support for students who are working on the very digital projects and assignments that grow out of the collaborations that Jesse and his team foster with faculty. So we work in very close synergy with one another, but my focus is more and more on students as opposed to on faculty and course development. And so I was asked, when I was originally asked to give this talk, so I want to preface this talk by saying, I don't think I'm going to weep, but please forgive me if I do. This talk came at a very, very difficult moment for all of us preparing this talk. And so there's a way in which I kind of feel like this is like my therapy session, that you guys are all my active listeners who are going to get me through this. So in any case, when I first started planning for the presentation, I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted to talk about, and I had a pretty good idea of how I wanted to talk about those things. But what I'm actually going to start with today is to tell you about what I was planning on doing, which I'm not doing, and then explain to you how I've ended up and where I've ended up. So first, our hosts here at Coventry had asked if I could provide some kind of summative piece to today's activities, a way to frame and present some of the main ideas that you all have been grappling with and some of the responses to the questions that you guys have been grappling with today. And in planning for today, they and Jesse and I came up with a plan to seed the day's conversations over the course of the preceding week with a Twitter chat about the very same questions that you guys have been working on today. And in addition, I was, to coincide with that virtual conversation, I built this site. This is the website that I built. I had built this the days leading up to last Tuesday. And it was a website that we were going to put out there at the same time that Jesse was going to invite people to participate in a DigPed chat on Twitter, asking members of our online networks to seed this conversation and respond to some of the same questions that you guys are working with. And in particular, my website was geared towards asking people to submit short media responses as a way to respond. And we were planning on collecting those and sharing those. I had grand ideas of what I would turn that into. And I was kind of really excited to execute this and to see what kind of final summative presentation and talk I could give to you all. And about a week and a half before we were due to leave, Daniel contacted Jesse and me and asked for a title and an abstract for our talks. I was happy to see that title actually isn't in the program, because I've, for reasons I will now explain, have somewhat left that title behind. And I struggled a little bit with it even at that point, because I knew this was going to be summative. It was difficult for me to predict in an abstract what I was going to be talking about. I didn't know what I was going to get from the community, both the virtual online community as well as your community here. But that was okay. I had a vague sense of where we were likely to end up, and I knew there were particular projects like Domain of One's Own, which I'll come back to later, that I wanted to focus on. And so I was able to pull that together. And I wanted to do something sort of playful as well. And so I settled on this title, Over, Under, Around, and Through. And I want to talk to you about where that came from. But I felt like that was kind of a playful way of suggesting a way through a path, a path through our future, a path to our future, and the many different ways that we might find ourselves moving forward. And so the origin of this actually comes from this children's book. It's a terrible book. And let me ask this. I realized last night that I wasn't sure. Sesame Street is like a thing here, right? Okay. I was afraid that maybe I had been a little bit too focused on my own culture and my own childhood and forgot that maybe this wasn't. But yes, so this is also a part of your normal childhood. So this is a book that my kids loved. And the basic story of the book is it's about Big Bird being big and Elmo being small, and they work together. And through the telling of that story, we learn about opposites and prepositions like in and out and above and under, and what those mean in relationship to each other. And my kids love this book, and I just liked the metaphorical idea that as we grapple with the future of our institutions, we need to be willing to look in every corner and to forge paths in unexpected directions, and that in fact the path forward is not always right in front of us, right? But that we sometimes have to go underground, or we sometimes have to go around corners, or we even have to go through dangerous places in order to come out on some brighter, more hopeful place, a future for ourselves and for our schools. And so then we were just ready to announce on Twitter this DigPed chat, and I was ready to announce this website, and Jesse and I were getting ready to pack our bags. And the US election happened Tuesday night of last week. And I don't know how to explain this other than that the entire world turned completely upside down overnight. And it sounds sort of dramatic, but I mean that very, very literally. That in the past week, it has felt to me and to Jesse and to our colleagues in the United States that we are living in some alternate reality. I actually really love alternate reality fiction, like futuristic fiction exploring alternate realities. And there are days when I wake up and I hope that I'm in the middle of one of those novels. I don't actually hope that, but I feel like I'm in the middle of one of those novels. So, and I know that the elections in the United States impact your country as well, and I also suspect that you can relate to this feeling after your own experience with some national voting this past year. So on Wednesday morning last week, the day that we were supposed to be doing this, after both of us barely sleeping at all, I messaged Jesse about 7:30 that morning, and I said, how can we possibly put out a call today to our online community, which was reeling, asking them to submit media responses to a prompt about the future of higher education, right? So, like, on the one hand, there was a really good chance that if people did respond, the responses we were gonna get were going to be colored by so much heartache and so much fear and so much anger that they weren't going to be remotely useful to moving a conversation forward. And even more than that, though, and more importantly than that, it felt really tone deaf and really callous for us to try and pivot the conversation that was happening in our social networks away from the processing people were doing and the mourning that was happening and the grief that was being displayed, and ask them now to talk about, hey, let's talk about our future, submit an animated GIF. So we couldn't do that. And so luckily, our colleagues here at Coventry understood that and have been very patient with us as we've kind of rethought how we were gonna come to this conversation. So this is a brief aside. I was working on these slides last night, and I joked on Twitter that at the moment when you're searching for images and the terms you're using are terms like shattered and lost, you know that you are suffering still from, I call it post-election flu. So since that moment, since that evening, since that next morning, I've worried almost constantly about what I was going to say to you today. Because suddenly the notion that forging our future could be as simple as going over, under, around, or through, a proposition that actually seemed like kind of an important and welcome way to frame the challenges ahead of us a week ago, this seemed so naive and so out of touch and so frankly disrespectful of the people for whom the outcome of these elections actually do not present viable paths forward. So, sorry. So I'm standing here today begging a certain amount of latitude and openness from you with me as I struggle through my own response to the critical questions that we're facing in light of our own critical circumstances. The truth of the matter is that in face of these critical circumstances, I am at a loss. I'm at a complete loss. I've never felt this way before in my professional life of where to go, or my personal life. In the US, we are caught up in what I can only call a storm of uncertainty surrounding our future. and what's going to happen with our new administration. And there's absolutely no one, not even my mother. My mother is the one who always gives me answers. My mom can't even help me with this. That is truly, saying that is the most heartbreaking thing for me to have to acknowledge. We have no one who can provide answers for us about what this sea change means for our students, for our teaching, for our schools in the next 6 months, in the next year, in the next 2 years, in the next 4 years, in the next decade. There is a lot of speculation, and we're having to live with the monster of that speculation as well, right? Because the speculation is almost as poisonous as the uncertainty, although it is necessary for us to speculate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of that speculation is and the reality that we're facing. And I don't know in what ways this resonates with you. I suspect it does, and I'm interested in hearing from all of you about how this resonates. So here's one reality. We have a former conservative extremist Republican candidate whose name was being thrown around as our future head of the National Department of Education. His name is Ben Carson. And he has in the past suggested that if he became president, he wouldn't do away with the Department of Education. He would simply use it now to police speech on U.S. college campuses, going so far as to curtail federal funds supporting schools in which he deems extreme political bias is being exhibited. We have, with our president, the language of extreme vetting of immigrants and refugees. That he's told us that he's in favor of extreme vetting that has the potential to significantly impact our recruitment of foreign students and faculty, undermining truly decades of work that we have been doing in higher education to try and diversify these bodies of people on our campuses. Trump actually has a vision for higher education, to the extent we can call it a vision. He suggests that he plans to double down on post-secondary online education and focus entirely on the delivery of content via tech-enhanced platforms rather than on human teaching, which is what we all practice. And let me be really clear about this. I am an educational technologist, but I am by absolutely no means a technology utopianist. And for me, the moment when we use the terms technology-enriched delivery models to talk about the art of teaching, we've lost our way. There's no way to turn that into something hopeful. But perhaps what's most frightening is simply what's most frightening, which is that throughout his campaign, Trump has used rhetoric, as you all know, that has encouraged racist, xenophobic, misogynistic, homophobic, and transphobic behavior and speech among his supporters. And all the backtracking and all the message massaging that is going to happen between now and January 28th, our inauguration day, cannot undo this damage. It cannot undo this damage. And that hatred is antithetical to everything that education is. And I won't argue that. That is a truth, as much as it is a truth that Hillary Clinton is winning the popular vote. So, as I prepared for this week and for this talk and for this future that we're now facing, I had to think of something. And so the only thing I've been able to think of, and Jesse hinted at this early, is an approach, the only approach that I can think of to take, which is that we all have to act in whatever small, brave ways we can to create spaces for ourselves and for our students that help us move not to our future, but through our future, because we are in our future. It's here. And the time to act is now. And I don't actually know where that will lead, because I don't know where on earth we're heading. But I do know that there are, and there can be, power in these small, brave acts. And I'm holding hope in my own heart that if as many of us as possible act in those small, brave ways, we can find our way through this. So I want to talk a little bit about my own history with my own approach to what it means to act in small, brave ways. And when it comes to this, I arrive through the same lens that has filtered all of my academic training and professional life's work. I am an educational technologist. And so the challenge I've been putting to myself over the last week is to ask myself, when it comes to how I talk about technology, what small acts, what small conversations, what small brave moments can I instill in my classes, in my work with the tutors that I mentor, and in my interactions with the teachers and leaders who are my colleagues at the university. And here's the really hard truth. And it's something I've long known, not just suspected, known, which is that the very technology that I found so enchanting, what drew me to this field, and that I find so empowering and so full of possibility, sits very, very squarely in the middle of this particular awful moment of history that we are all now wrapping our hearts and our heads around. So this is, I don't know, does anybody know who this is? This is an American comic strip from the mid-20th century. It's Pogo Possum. I grew up, it's actually before my time, but when I was young, my brother would go to garage sales in the United States and he would buy Pogo Possum comic books. And so we had a big collection of them and I would read them. And when I was a kid and I would have a nightmare or a bad dream, or I couldn't sleep because I was worrying about something, I would grab a Pogo Possum comic book, and that would be the thing that would calm me and get me through. But even Pogo is a philosopher. He's a possum, but he's also a philosopher, as possums are. And this particular comic, this particular piece from the strip, Walt Kelly, the drawer of this comic, was a huge environmentalist, and this was about Pogo and his animal friends who live in Okefenokee Swamp in southern United States, reflecting on the fact that the environment had been destroyed and the destruction was being done by them. So since the close of the US election, I've seen a number of individuals, this is a reality, in my professional network pointing out, we all know this, the hugely problematic ways in which social media played a role in advancing mistruths about our candidates. And so I hadn't heard the news about the word of the year, the post-truth as a word of a year. But there's simply no doubt that this is happening in our social networks and that the consequences that we are now living through have been very, very dire. So this is, if you don't follow this gentleman, this is my friend Mike Caulfield. That's his blog, hapgood.us, and he's actually working on a book project right now to disentangle this very issue of the impact of social media on sort of our culture, particularly in the political arena. I spoke with him about this 4 days before the election, when we were both saying, there's no way it could happen, and then it happened. But the truth is that, we've actually known about this for a really long time, and I'm gonna kind of take you back in time through my own progression. So last fall, I teach a first-year seminar on digital identity, and I'd been noticing, particularly on my own Facebook, the number of people who I knew and liked and respected, sharing things on Facebook that it wasn't even, if you clicked on the things and went and read them, they actually didn't say, actually said the opposite of what they were supposedly saying. And people would just share this stuff blindly, and so I asked my students, what's your practice here? When you're in these networks and somebody shares something and it's provocative, what do? Do you click on it and read it? Do you do your own research? Do you share blindly? And I showed them the website Snopes, which is my go-to. If anybody in my network shares something that I'm I don't know about that, I always check it on Snopes to see. I try not to shame people when I find out they've shared, but sometimes I do. None of my students had heard of it. I think maybe one student had heard of Snopes. And what I was really struck by was, in their reaction to this, was that they were sort of disinterested in the issue. There wasn't a lot of concern about this. They didn't see this as a problem, right? What they saw sharing as they were interested in sharing things that made a good story. That was what mattered, and that sparked a reaction, and that resulted in more sharing, right? And I want to be really, really clear here, though. This is not a disease of traditional college-age students. This is not a millennial disease. This is an epidemic that spans all of our generations and that has been fostered and nurtured actually by traditional media initially, but that's currently consuming our worlds of social and new media. And it is a disease that we collectively take responsibility for and we collectively suffer from. So I am not pointing the finger at the next generation and saying, see, there's the post-truth generation. That's who we have to blame for this. That's not the reality of what we see when we're in these spaces. So here's another story. This happened a long time ago. Not a long time ago, a relative long time ago. But it goes back even farther in my own narrative. So there's been evidence for quite some time that new media was shaping our cultural narrative in really troubling ways. So a few years ago, this was probably like 6, 7 years ago, in the United States, there was this huge debate centered in New York City about an Islamic community center that was getting built, or was slated to be built in downtown Manhattan. And conservative mainstream media outlets picked up on this story, and they began to spin the narrative, and they referred to the building as the Ground Zero Mosque. And they would repeatedly talk about how it was blocks away from Ground Zero and how this was a travesty, and that it was offensive to the memories of everybody who had lost their lives on September 11th. Now, this description was a gross mischaracterization of the actual project. So what the building really was a community center. It did have a prayer room in it, but it was a huge community center, and it was actually aimed at promoting interfaith dialogue. Like, that was really the goal of this building and this project. And when it first was picked up on by the media, it received a lot of positive coverage because it was promoting interfaith dialogue. And then a few conservative bloggers picked up on it, and then it got picked up on the mainstream media, and that's when it started to get referred to as Ground Zero Mosque. So that's when things get really weird. A few more responsible news outlets and journalists started to push back on this. They wanted to reshape the perception of this as being a mosque a block away from Ground Zero, and this lie. And there was actually a memo, I think it was at the New York Times. It was one of the larger newspapers, an internal memo that circulated telling journalists, stop, do not use that language. Here is how we are going to refer to this. And here is how we're going to help people understand the truth of this. It didn't work. And the reason was because once that term, Ground Zero Mosque, became the term that we all started to associate with the project, correcting it became almost impossible, because that's what people were searching for to get information about the story. So when people wanted to know the truth, if they didn't search for Ground Zero Mosque, the truth was hidden from them. That's the power that Google has to shape our perceptions. And that power is almost absolute, and it is almost absolutely unchallenged, and it is almost absolutely misunderstood or ignored. So this is one more story from my own narrative. Because I'm still learning, and I'm still learning to stand corrected about my own missteps. Several years ago, my university, we kind of originated Domain of One's Own at Mary Washington. It started as a full project in 2000, and I always get this wrong, fall of 13, and I was the project manager for it. And so I spent a lot of time going and talking to students about domains and what a domain could be and what they should put on their domain. And so I decided, I had a blog, but I didn't really have much more at my domain, and I really wanted to take time to more deliberately build out my own domain to show it as an example for students. So I changed the theme of my site, and I put up a new photo, I updated my bio, I put up my CV as an HTML and as a PDF file there, and I connected to some of my social networks. And after completing the project, I was really proud of myself. I went home and I showed it to my husband, and I was waiting for him to say, "That looks great, honey." And the first response he said, "Can you please remove our home phone number and address from your CV?" And I got really mad. I got really angry with him. Like, we had a big fight about this, actually. Because I was like, the information that he wants me to remove, this is public information. Anybody can find it. Our number isn't unlisted. Our address is in public directories. Anybody who wanted to find it with a little digging could. And what he was requesting to do, I said to him, was more about signaling safety to himself than it was about actually guaranteeing any safety for me or our children or our family. And also, didn't he know that I'm an educational technologist and this is what I do for a living, and so he should just trust me? I'm an expert in my field. And I was really mad. I eventually capitulated because I could tell how strongly he felt, right? And there are sometimes moments for those of us who are married or in these kinds of relationships, there are those moments when your partner disagrees with you, but you realize this is not the fight to pick. Like, for whatever reason, we're gonna let them win this one. So I let him win, but I was still mad. I was really resentful. And so then a few years later, the Gamergate situation happened in the United States. And I was increasingly exposed through my social networks to stories of women, some of whom I knew, who were on the receiving end of online harassment, abuse, and doxing as well, and swatting. And in the midst of it, we brought Audrey Waters to our campus to talk about these issues. And she was talking and she was giving this talk, and all of a sudden I realized I was so wrong. Like, my husband was so right and I was so wrong. Because I realized that I had been playing really fast and loose with this game, right? Like, I was practicing radical openness. And by calling it that and by holding it up as this sort of lauded goal or ideal for ourselves, I wasn't actually thinking critically about what it meant. So I haven't been the victim of online abuse, as our other keynote speaker today so eloquently talked about his own experiences. But I know people who have, like Jesse. And while my home phone number and address are publicly available, there's no reason for me to draw those lines so clearly for people, particularly when we're not just talking about my safety. We're talking about the safety of my husband and my children as well, right? We're talking about other people. This isn't just my choice to make. But maybe even more troubling and shaming for me was, as an educator, I teach an online digital storytelling class called DS 106, which practices radical openness. We encourage students to share very, very openly the work that they do in the process of building creative pieces. How could I have been asking students, many of whom are part of vulnerable populations, how could I have been doing this, working this way, without even acknowledging the complexity of these questions? And I call myself a professional. So I went home that night and I told my husband he was right. He doesn't hold it against me. So I'm telling these stories so you can understand the journey I've gone on, as I've learned how to navigate these online spaces and as I've tried to figure out what my own responsibility is. As an educator who's not only asking my students to use these spaces, but who wants their usage to grow into their own journey of understanding and their own asking of critical questions and their own thinking and unpacking these difficult, difficult issues. So one small act that I try to take when I work with students with technology is to always be promoting that critical conversation about how the web works, expecting them to learn how the web works and how those inner machinations actually can cause harm on really deep political and social and economic levels. And let me be clear, I'm talking a lot about this idea of small acts and brave acts. I'm not suggesting small is easy. Small is not easy. Small doesn't necessarily mean simple. In order to take small acts, we have to do deep critical thinking ourselves. We have to commit to developing and nurturing our critical lenses. And we can't turn away when the problems seem really complicated or the conversations become hard or our students or our colleagues or our spouses seem disinterested, right? That's a commitment that we have to make, and we have to accept that we will get it wrong sometimes. And that's okay too. That one small act we take is we stand up and we say, I got that wrong. And this is why, and this is what I'm gonna try and do to change that. So when I talk to students about these issues, where we always end up, because we are at the University of Mary Washington, is we talk to them then about how do they, as citizens of the web, as people who live on the web actively, how do they position themselves within this very powerful and often problematic space? So at Mary Washington, as I've mentioned, we have Domain of One's Own. And that's a project that allows any student, actually any faculty, staff, or student, to claim a domain name of their own while they're with the university. We pay for it. And then build out a web presence of their own at that domain. So Domain of One's Own can serve a lot of practical purposes, and often when we talk about that project, that's what we tend to focus on. So it's great, it's easy to talk about how we can have students build a digital portfolio, right? And how they can easily share the work of a class online, and that's important. And very often we talk about it that way because that faculty immediately get that, right? Faculty can say, oh, well, I can see how that could serve a purpose or serve a need. Or students say, oh, well, I'm graduating in 6 months and I really wanna have something out there that I can put on my resume. So that practical methodology is really effective as a way to bring people into the conversation. But what we rarely talk about, I shouldn't say rarely, what we don't talk about enough with domain of one's own is how it's actually a space which pushes against the structural deficiencies of the web. That really is what domain of one's own does. Sure, you get an online CV, and that is great. But there is so much more, so many more important things are happening when we do this right. And if we don't talk about those structural deficiencies, if we don't unpack for our students and with our students, why does Facebook ask all of those questions of us in its profile template? Like, what's happening when we fill out that profile template for Facebook? Or if we don't challenge, why is it that Twitter, which, you know, I would say as a company has some pretty spectacular computing power at their fingertips, why is it they can't actually manage to monitor and silence and stop abuse? When those of us who witness it, it is so clear what we are witnessing, right? Why is it so impossible for Twitter to do that? What's happening there? And if we don't discuss why Google's top news results about the popular vote 3 days after the election, so if you Googled, you know, popular US presidential popular vote in Google 3 days after the election, the top article was stating that Trump was prevailing over Clinton, even though factually everybody knew that was wrong. So why is that happening? These are the questions that these are the questions that preface a conversation about domain of one's own. And I use it as an entry point for talking to students about why we have a domain. But we can't stop asking the questions just because they finally got a domain and now they're building a WordPress site and they have started to share their classwork. These questions have to continue to be asked. They have to continue to be grappled with. And if we don't do that, then we aren't doing the brave work that we all have to do if we're going to move through this space of uncertainty. That's it. Thank you.